The Middle Ages knew no mercy. To be condemned in this time was not simply to meet death, it was to be unmade, to have body and spirit torn apart as a warning to all who dared defy the order of the world. Flesh was no longer flesh, it became parchment upon which kings and councils wrote their decrees. Every execution was a script, every wound a word, every cry a sentence meant to echo in the memory of those who watched. Across the fields and cobbled squares of England, scaffolds rose like black monuments. At the gallows, men dangled until their breaths snapped and their bodies swayed in the cold air, grotesque silhouettes against the sky. Yet mercy was never in the design. Cut down before death could claim them fully, many still twitched, eyes wide with terror, hands clawing at nothing. These half-living bodies were dragged to the block, where steel and ritual completed what the rope had begun. Others faced a darker fate. The condemned were laid bare before the multitude, their garments stripped, their pride scattered like dust. Blades flashed and bellies were torn open. The stench of blood and offal filled the square, rising in the air like incense of terror. Entrails, still warm, were pulled free and displayed before the crowd, not as proof of guilt, but as proof of power. The body was no longer a vessel of life, but an altar of obedience, upon which lords carved their sovereignty. Still more were given to the horses, limbs bound to ropes, ropes tied to beasts, the air thick with the sound of hooves and whips. When the animals strained, the body stretched to its limit, every tendon singing, every bone groaning. The inevitable crack was not a mere fracture. It was a sermon, a lesson taught in agony, preached not with words but with sinew and splintered bone. Each snap was a commandment, obey or be torn. This was not justice, nor fairness, nor the blind balance of law. It was theater, dark theater, staged not to heal but to terrify, not to uphold truth but to display power. These punishments were not for the condemned alone. They were for the thousands who watched. Fathers clutching their children's shoulders, wives hiding their faces in trembling hands, priests muttering prayers no louder than whispers. All eyes were forced to witness, because in witnessing, they learned submission. The lesson was carved not only on the flesh of the dying, but upon the souls of the living. England lived in that ritual of dread. Every town had its whispers, every village its tale of the scaffold. In the tavern, men spoke of who had last been hanged. In the market, women murmured of whose body had been burned. In the churches, the bells tolled not only for the dead, but for the warning the dead had become. Fear seeped into bread and wine, into prayer and laughter, until life itself was shadowed by the memory of punishment. And so the centuries turned. Beneath the gray sky of England, power fed upon blood, and authority dressed itself in cruelty. To live was to walk beneath the constant shadow of death's stage. To rebel was to step willingly into its spotlight. And now the camera drifts, lingering on gallows swaying in the wind. On the quartering block, stained a deep crimson that no rain could wash away. It passes over peasants huddled in fear, whispering of who might be next, and settles at last upon the greatest city of the realm, London. There, in the year 1330, rises the scaffold at Tyburn. Its timbers, rough and dark, stand against the heavens like a challenge to mercy itself. Crows circle above, sensing the feast to come. The earth around it is already blackened by countless drops of blood, hardened by the weight of too many bodies. It is a place not of redemption, but of ritual, the ritual of dread. And into this world stepped Roger Mortimer, a man who had risen from the shadows of the marches, who had dared to grasp power not meant for him, who had laid claim to both crown and queen. He was a lover, whispered about in scandal. He was a ruler, feared and envied. He was a traitor, named so by the law of kings. But in the end, he was a victim of the same theater of cruelty that had consumed so many before him and would consume so many after. At Tyburn, beneath the gray sky, his story would end as all power ends, not with triumph, but with the axe. In the dim glow of candlelight, behind the walls of royal chambers, where secrets were dressed in silk and shadows, a union was forged. Roger Mortimer, son of the Welsh marches, outlaw and exile turned lord, now shared more than whispers with the Queen of England. Isabella of France, the she-wolf, daughter of a king, mother to a boy not yet grown into his crown, had found in Mortimer not only a lover, but an ally, a weapon, a partner in rule. History remembers him as her paramour, but in that moment he was more. He was the hidden king. His hands reached across maps spread on oaken tables, where seals of authority lay broken and reformed to his command. His name was etched into decrees, though never spoken in public. His shadow, long and uninvited, darkened the throne itself. With Isabella, he had toppled a king. Together they had brought down Edward II, husband and father, betrayed and slain in the echoing silence of a castle cell. The boy who inherited the crown, Edward III, was king in name, but it was Mortimer who ruled. He sat at council as though it were his birthright. He issued judgments as though God himself had anointed his brow. He walked beside Isabella not as servant, but as sovereign, and the realm trembled under the weight of his ambition. But kingdoms are not so easily tamed. Whispers began to stir in corridors, slithering through the halls of Westminster. Nobles grumbled in their feasts, their laughter edged with venom. Clerics muttered in Latin, careful their prayers did not turn to curses. Men spoke of scandal, of shame, of a queen who had abandoned virtue for desire, and of a lord who had abandoned loyalty for power. Every whisper was a spark, and England was dry kindling. Mortimer believed himself secure. He believed the boy king malleable, a crown of gold resting on a child's head. But time does not stand still, and children do not remain children. Edward grew in silence, his eyes cold, his fists clenched, watching as his mother's lover ruled in his name. He listened to the murmurs of discontent, to the sighs of lords who bent knee reluctantly, to the warnings of those who dared risk their tongues. And in his silence, Edward learned, for silence is a dangerous tutor. It teaches patience, it teaches endurance, and above all, it teaches the art of waiting for the perfect moment. The court saw only a boy, draped in velvet, crowned in gold, smiling when commanded, speaking when told. But within that boy burned a fire his mother could not smother, and Mortimer could not command. It was the fire of a king denied his throne, of a lion cub growing claws. And so the lovers continued their dance, oblivious or willfully blind. In the privacy of chambers, Isabella leaned close, her voice a whisper, her breath mingling with Mortimer's. Maps stretched before them like offerings, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, France. All were territories to be bent, borders to be claimed. And Mortimer, intoxicated by desire and dominion, believed the realm already his. Yet desire is a fragile shield against envy. Power is a brittle crown when not your own. And the higher a man climbs on borrowed ladders, the further he has to fall when they are pulled away. The nobles saw it. They saw his arrogance swell with each passing season. They saw Isabella's smile grow sharper, her once queenly dignity swallowed by passion and intrigue. And behind closed doors, they began to ask the unspoken question, how long until this boy king becomes a man? England itself seemed to whisper the same. In the marketplaces, gossip spoke of Mortimer's boldness. In the alehouses, men toasted not to their king, but to his downfall. In the shadows of churches, prayers rose not for God's mercy, but for deliverance from the usurper who ruled without a crown. Every murmur drew the net tighter. Every whispered curse sharpened the blade that would one day fall. And Edward, silent, observant, endured it all. His youth became his mask, his patience his weapon. Behind his cold eyes, the plan began to take shape. Mortimer, the queen's lover, the shadow on the throne, had written his own doom the moment he mistook a boy for a puppet. For a puppet will dance as long as the strings are tight, but once the knife severs them, it does not dance, it strikes. And in that candlelit chamber, as Isabella's hand brushed Mortimer's cheek, as parchments of conquest lay scattered across the table, the seeds of ruin were already sown. The lovers thought themselves untouchable. The boy thought otherwise. History would remember this not as a love story, but as a betrayal, one that darkened a crown, one that would lead a man from the queen's bed to the scaffold of Tyburn. The autumn wind carried a sharpness, and within the walls of Nottingham Castle, silence conspired with shadows. Torches flickered in long stone corridors, their flames bowing and bending as armored feet pressed forward. At the head of this silent procession walked Edward III, not the boy the world believed him to be, but a young man grown hard by patience and secrecy. Each step he took echoed not only in the castle's halls, but in the history of England itself. For years, Roger Mortimer had ruled in his name. For years, he had carried himself not as servant, but as sovereign, using the Queen's hand as his shield and her bed as his throne. But Edward had learned well. He had learned to wear obedience as a mask, to let silence be his sword. Now, in the deep of night, the mask would be torn away, and the sword would strike. The knights behind him did not speak. They did not need to. Their loyalty had been sworn in whispers, in glances, in the language of men who knew the risk of treason and the greater risk of hesitation. Each carried in his chest the weight of history, for what they would do this night was no simple arrest. It was the unmaking of a tyrant, the severing of a queen's scandal from the body of the crown. The heavy doors loomed ahead, carved oak reinforced with iron. Beyond them, Mortimer slept in the chamber of the queen, secure in the belief that power was permanent, that crowns could be borrowed forever. But power is never borrowed. It is only stolen, and every theft demands repayment. The doors burst open, splinters scattered like sparks. The chamber was awash in sudden light, torches flaring against tapestries and gilded stone. And there, in the tangle of rich blankets, Roger Mortimer rose. Not in majesty, but in panic. His eyes widened, his breath caught, his hands reached for weapons not there. Half dressed, half dreaming, he was a man stripped of armor, stripped of dignity, stripped at last of the illusion of control. Beside him, Isabella screamed. Her cry was not only of fear, but of desperation, for she knew that in Mortimer's fall lay the ruin of her own defiance. "He is your guardian," she cried. "He is your savior." But her words rang hollow, powerless against the steel of truth. Edward's reply cut sharper than any blade. "He is my jailer, and England's shame." In those words, the years of silent watching were given voice. In those words, the boy was gone, and the king was born. Mortimer lunged, perhaps to fight, perhaps to flee, but the knights were upon him, shackles clamped around his wrists, iron biting into flesh, that once signed decrees as if he were master of the realm. His face, once proud, now struck the stones. Blood mingled with dust. The great Lord of England, the Shadow King, was dragged like a common criminal across the cold floor. The Queen's pleas dissolved into sobs, her hands outstretched yet powerless to command. For all her titles, she could not halt the tide that had risen against her lover. The boy she had sought to rule had turned, and the tide was merciless. Through the castle's corridors, Mortimer was hauled into the night. The torches lit his shame, revealing not the conqueror of kings, but the defeated captive. The same silence that had once been Edward's weapon now hung in the air, heavy and final, as though the stones themselves knew the weight of what had passed. And thus, in the stillness of October 1330, betrayal came full circle. The betrayer was betrayed, the usurper undone. Mortimer had risen on the strength of another's crown, and in the end, that crown crushed him. The hall was thick with murmurs, as though the very walls trembled with the voices of men hungry for blood. Lords gathered shoulder to shoulder, their robes heavy with fur, their eyes sharper than daggers. Above them, banners swayed in the draught, reminders of the realm Mortimer had once ruled in all but name. Now, stripped of command, he stood not as a lord, but as a prisoner. Chains bound his wrists, iron carved into his skin, and every step to the center of the chamber rang with finality. There was no trial, not in the sense of justice. No jury sat to weigh truth against lies. No counsel dared to speak on his behalf. His crimes had been written long before his body was dragged into the hall. Usurper, they called him. Murderer of Edward II. Seducer of the Queen. The words fell like stones, each one thrown not to wound, but to bury. The voices of his accusers rose in waves. thundering against him, until the air itself seemed to quake with fury. But Mortimer did not bow his head. Though blood streaked his face, though his body bore the bruises of capture, his eyes burned with the same defiance that had carried him to power. He knelt because he was forced to kneel, not because he chose it. And in his gaze there lingered the echo of the man who once ruled England without a crown. Behind a veil, Isabella sat in silence. The she-wolf who had once commanded armies, who had shared Mortimer's bed and ambition, now reduced to a shadow. Her tears glimmered, but whether for her lover or for herself, none could say. She knew the lords would not spare him. She knew the tide had turned, and her own power hung by a thread finer than silk. Still she watched, bound not by chains but by consequence, her every breath a reminder that love and power are treacherous allies. And there stood Edward. No longer the boy whose crown Mortimer had worn like a trophy. He was the king in truth now, his youth hardened by betrayal, his silence sharpened into judgment. He did not shout, did not jeer. He simply watched, calm as stone, while his mother's lover knelt in disgrace. In Edward's eyes, the hall saw not mercy, but the cold fire of a ruler who understood that power must sometimes be written in blood. No jury, no mercy, the voice of history intones. His fate had already been written. This was not judgment. It was vengeance wrapped in law. Every lord who cried out against Mortimer did so with more than justice in mind. They remembered his arrogance, the weight of his shadow across their lands, the humiliation of bowing to a man who wore no crown. They did not want fairness. They wanted retribution, and Edward, though king, needed no urging. For him, this was not merely the punishment of a traitor, but the reclaiming of a throne stolen in silence. The hall became a theater, each accusation a line rehearsed, each lord an actor playing his part. Yet the outcome was already carved into the stone beneath their feet. Mortimer was guilty, not because evidence proved it, but because England demanded it. Still, his lips curled, bloodied but unbroken, as if to whisper that power had been his, if only for a moment. His eyes locked with Edward's, defiant to the end, as though daring the young king to strike the final blow. And so the verdict was delivered, not by gavel, but by silence. The silence of a court that had no need to speak what all already knew. Mortimer would die. His body would be broken, his name blackened, his life extinguished beneath the blade. But even in chains and disgrace, he remained unyielding. For in the theater of power, sometimes defiance is the only crown left to wear. Dawn broke cold over London, a gray and bitter light that offered no comfort. From the depths of the tower, a cart rattled into the streets, its wheels creaking as though burdened by more than wood and iron, burdened by history itself. Upon it sat Roger Mortimer, bound in chains, his body pale, his once proud figure reduced to a shadow of power undone. Once he had walked these streets as a master, surrounded by guards who bowed at his command, cheered by courtiers who feared his wrath. But now he was carried through them as carrion, thrown to the hunger of the mob. The people pressed close, their voices rising in jeers and curses. Some spat, others hurled stones that struck his shoulders and chest. Every impact was a reminder that the hands that once gripped the reins of England now could not shield his flesh. The bells tolled. Their heavy notes rolled across the rooftops like thunder, not in mourning, but in warning. Each peal declared, "Here rides the traitor, here rides the thief of crowns, here rides the man who dared to touch a queen and grasp a throne." London rose to see him fall. Mortimer lifted his head, straining against his bonds, his eyes turning upward to the indifferent sky. The clouds hung low, swollen with silence, as if heaven itself had no words for what it witnessed. His breath came heavy, shallow, each inhale tasting of dust and smoke, each exhale a struggle against despair. Through the narrow lanes the cart rolled, and the city answered. Hands reached from the crowd, some to strike, some to grasp at the prisoner as if touching him might transfer his shame. Children screamed, their fear mingled with fascination, their cries echoing like ghosts of innocence lost. Priests muttered prayers, lips trembling, their words hidden beneath the roar of the masses. The city itself became a chorus, rage, fear, sorrow, and spectacle all woven together in a single dirge. And there on the horizon rose the scaffold. Tyburn, its timbers black with the memory of countless deaths, its wood darkened by blood the rain could never cleanse. Against the gray morning sky it loomed, not merely as a structure of execution, but as a monument to dread. Every Londoner knew its silhouette. Every soul carried its shadow. Now Mortimer would mount its steps, as so many before him had done, and as so many after him would follow. The cart slowed. The crowd thickened. Faces pressed together, straining for a glimpse of the fallen lord. Whispers threaded through the air, of his arrogance, of his sins, of his fall from the queen's embrace to the hangman's stage. Yet others were silent, eyes fixed, breath caught, for they too knew the cruelty of power, and in Mortimer's ruin they saw both warning and prophecy. Mortimer's chest heaved. His eyes, hollow yet unbroken, stared ahead. The scaffold was no longer distant. It was the ground beneath his fate. He could see the executioner now, a grim figure sharpening his axe upon the stone. The scrape of steel on stone carried like thunder through the silence, each stroke a countdown, each spark a reminder of the blade that would soon sever flesh from soul. Once he commanded kings, the voice of history whispers. Now he is paraded like carrion, offered to the hunger of the mob. And so the cart came to rest. The prisoner's breath hung in the air like frost. Around him London leaned closer, drawn by the terrible magnetism of death. The stage was set, the actors assembled. Only the final act remained. The scaffold stood silent, a black silhouette against the pale morning sky. Around it, the crowd pressed close. Thousands of faces turned upward, their breaths held in dreadful anticipation. For all the noise of jeers and curses that had filled the streets, here, at the foot of the platform, there was only stillness. Silence heavier than prayer, thicker than smoke, broken only by the creak of timber beneath the weight of history. Roger Mortimer was led forward. Chains rattled as he stumbled, his steps unsteady, but his eyes unflinching. Ropes bound his hands, cutting into skin that had once signed decrees, once held Isabella close in stolen embraces. Now those same hands were useless, tied before the spectacle of his ruin. He was forced to kneel, the boards beneath him dark with stains of those who had knelt before. Each drop of blood that had dried there was a reminder that death at Tyburn was never singular. It was part of a ritual, a cycle without end. The executioner stepped forward, faceless beneath his hood, the great axe gleaming in the faint light. He tested its weight, raised it once, then rested it on his shoulder. And in that moment, time stretched. The world seemed to hold its breath. Even the crows circling above stilled their wings, as if the air itself awaited the fall of the blade. In that moment, the voice of history whispers, all his power, all his passions, all his sins, reduced to this, a neck, a blade, and a crowd demanding blood. Mortimer bowed his head, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in defiance, perhaps in weary acceptance of the fate that had stalked him since the night Edward burst into Nottingham Castle. Whatever thoughts passed behind his eyes, they were his alone, soon to be carried into silence. The axe rose high. A murmur rippled through the crowd, half gasp, half groan, the sound of 1,000 hearts tightening in unison. The blade hovered, the weight of vengeance condensed into a single moment suspended in air. Then it fell. A dull crack split the silence, wood and flesh meeting steel. The roar that followed was not triumph, but release, a storm of voices breaking loose, as though the city itself exhaled after years of suffocation. Blood spilled across the timbers, seeping into the boards, joining the stains of countless others who had fallen beneath the same ritual. The executioner lifted Mortimer's head high, gripping it by the hair, raising it against the gray sky. A grotesque trophy, proof of justice to some, proof of vengeance to others. The crowd surged forward, eyes wide, mouths open, their cries rising like waves against the scaffold. Children wept. Women turned away. Men shouted in fury or in satisfaction. Every face bore the mark of what they had seen. Above them all, the head of Roger Mortimer stared blank and unseeing, its lips parted as if to speak words that would never come. The sound of the crowd fades, replaced by the tolling of church bells, heavy and unyielding. So ended Roger Mortimer, the voice concludes, lover of a queen, ruler without a crown, undone not by foreign sword, but by the boy he once thought he owned. In the theater of kingship, loyalty is fleeting, power is borrowed, but vengeance is eternal. The scaffold fades into shadow, the faces dissolve into mist, and at last there is only darkness.